My granddaughter said I was confused. She said it was for my safety. But if that were true, why did my savings move while I was under anesthesia? In the next few minutes, you'll see what really happened and what she never expected a 72-year-old woman to prove. This is my story, and it isn't the one she tried to arrange for me. Thank you for being here. Have you ever felt your life was being simplified for your protection while your choices disappeared, one label at a time? Before we continue, leave a single word in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from or what time it is on your stove clock right now. If quiet, steel-spined stories speak to you, hit follow. The monitor's beeping was steady, but my chest wasn't. The nurse told me I'd done great and patted my arm like I'd finished a recital. Tasha squeezed my fingers and said she had everything handled, the way people talk when they want the room to stop asking questions. I wanted to let that sentence hold me. When the morphine thinned, I asked for my phone. 3 blue alerts waited like thumbtacks on a board. Transfer completed, transfer completed, transfer completed. Same bank, different amounts, all within 2 days. I read them twice, the way I reread recipes even after 50 years in the kitchen, and the numbers didn't change. Something inside me did. Did you move money? I asked. Tasha's voice turned soft, the tone you use with someone waking from a storm. You told me to, she said, for safety. Scammers have been hitting seniors at church, remember? I could picture the potluck table, plastic wrap over deviled eggs, Sister Ruth whispering about her debit card. I could also picture never handing anyone my passwords. I told her I'd like to see the confirmations later, and she said, of course, just rest. Her smile hovered without landing, like a picture frame on a nail that's too short. I closed my eyes and let the beeping count to 10 for me. Home 3 days later looked like my house dressed for strangers. The new lock chirped when Tasha held her phone to it, and the bolt slid back without a key. Smart, she said, and I put that word in my pocket with the other tiny splinters I keep for later. The hallway smelled like store-bought pine and lemon, bright and nowhere. My chair with the faded flowers was gone. A gray couch with perfect seams sat where my afternoons used to be. The crocheted blanket my mother made was replaced by a beige throw with a polite fringe. The pill calendar on the fridge had become a glossy grid with colored squares. I synced your meds, Tasha said, tapping green and yellow like a traffic light I hadn't agreed to. In the kitchen, my spice labels were printed and centered. Under the fresh white stickers, my crooked handwriting peeked through like a scar that refuses to fade. Tasha poured peppermint tea with her left hand and typed with her right, thumbs moving faster than questions. She said she'd moved boxes to the garage for flow so I wouldn't trip. I nodded because falling is expensive when you're 72 and stitched. I asked to check my banking app. She handed me my phone and said she had to reset something and we'd look after dinner. The icon that used to live in the bottom right was gone. My home screen felt like a drawer someone else had organized. I woke before dawn to the heater clicking on and the house answering in old wood. The microwave said 3:17 while the stove insisted on 9:41, and the disagreement felt truer than agreement would have. I opened the junk drawer where my yellow ledger lives. A soft notebook sat there instead, labeled household in purple pen. The handwriting leaned left, though Tasha writes with her right. Maybe she wrote in a hurry. Maybe she didn't write it at all. A white bin on the counter said Grandma's papers in the same purple ink, neat as a substitute teacher. Inside the bin, an envelope from the bank lay open like a mouth. I slid the letter out and read it twice, the way I double-check oven temps out of habit. Confirmation. Primary owner update. The date was 7 hours before my surgery. A tiny line at the bottom said, if you did not request this change, contact us immediately. I pressed my thumb to the help number and felt only my own pulse. Oatmeal? Tasha asked, setting a bowl down with a flourish that belonged to a cooking show. I said yes, and I said I wanted the verification emails from the transfers. She said, of course, and stirred her bowl without tasting it. After she left to pick up my prescriptions, I stood at the sink and watched Mr. Washington wave from his porch with his left hand like always. I realized I was watching hands. The purple label slanted left, Tasha signs right. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe I was braiding thin threads into rope because rope feels better than air. I went to the garage and breathed in dust and winter. Stacks of boxes reached for the ceiling, taped and labeled, careful in a way that tried to feel kind. My mother's blanket looked up at me through a clear bin, folded too thin for something that warm. Back at the table, I made a list in block letters because shaky cursive erases you faster. Find the last paper statement, find app login, ask for confirmations today. Ask kindly. I thought about the night I brought Tasha home in a car seat that clicked into my old Buick, the way she slept with her mouth open like a small question I was supposed to answer forever. I am not her mother. I am the woman who packed lunches, signed permission slips, and taught her to write her name in blue ink because blue looks like confidence on paper. I breathed, and the house breathed back. By afternoon, the sun laid a bright stripe across the dining table and showed me dust I hadn't seen yesterday. I opened my email and found another confirmation tucked between a coupon and the church newsletter. The subject line was cheerful in the way that makes you distrust cheer. I saved a copy to keep it close. Then I opened the bottom drawer of the side table out of habit and found my iPad, the thin blue one I thought we'd donated to the church thrift. It lit up after a long breath, patient and bright like a small door opening. I didn't go through it. I closed the cover and laid my palm on top until my hand stopped shaking. Evening brought the kind of tired that feels like gravity. Tasha lined up my pills and said, "Two with food," without meeting my eyes. I asked if we could sit after dinner and go through the confirmations together. She nodded too fast and brought her laptop to the table. We opened 2 emails and 1 receipt. The amounts matched my alerts. The destination looked like a string of characters built to be unreadable. "Temporary wallet," she said, "safer." I wrote the timestamps and the last 4 of the transfer IDs on a yellow sticky and pressed it to the bank letter. When we were done, I thanked her and said I needed to rest. In my room, the sign on the door that said guest room leaned because the hook was too big. I took it down and laid it face up on the dresser. The house creaked, old bone meeting new paint. I picked up the iPad. The lock screen showed my backyard last spring, the magnolia heavy with blooms I can't coax this year. I didn't swipe. I slid the bank letter underneath the tablet like a bookmark and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the quiet decide what to tell me next. The next morning, the house woke up before I did. A timer somewhere clicked and the blinds hummed up like a stage curtain, flooding the room with a polite brightness that wasn't asking my opinion. In the kitchen, the kettle was already warm, and a new dispenser sat by the sink, a shiny tower with days of the week stamped across its belly. 2 at 8, 1 at noon, Tasha said, tapping the lid the way you tap a fish tank to get attention. I watched her thumb hover over an app, and then the dispenser beeped, bright and mechanical. The sound was too cheerful for medicine. I swallowed the pills with mint tea and pretended the aftertaste didn't feel like a vote I hadn't cast. She had reorganized the pantry while I slept. Glass jars lined up in a perfect parade, labels printed in a font that looked like a kindergarten teacher with perfect posture. My old masking tape tags, crooked and yellowed, were gone. A bin on the bottom shelf read Grandma's Snacks with the apostrophe missing, and the air irked me more than it should have. "Flow," Tasha said, sliding a jar a half-inch to the right, as if the air could bruise. "You'll be able to reach everything." I nodded because reaching matters when your balance is a tender animal, but I touched the shelf and felt how cold the wood was, how it didn't remember my hands. Calls started mid-morning, but they didn't reach me. The house absorbed them. My church friend Helen texted that she tried the landline and got a message about privacy settings. A banner on my phone said screen time report with a number I did not understand, and a note below said managed by fam, Ely, along with a tiny green check that felt smug. When the doorbell rang, Mr. Washington stood on the porch with a bag of oranges and his old Marine's cap, and the smart lock blinked red until Tasha pressed a button on her screen. "We're keeping the door on schedule," she said, which sounded like something a hotel might say. I thanked him for the fruit and pretended not to see the way Tasha's jaw tensed when he asked how I was, as if concern needed clearance. At lunch, she set a salad down with the precision of a tray on an airplane and pulled the chair out for me like I was company. I noticed her fork in her right hand, knife in her left, a neat sawing motion she doesn't usually keep up for more than a few bites. She kept it up today, eyes on the plate. "You need protein," she said, and I noticed the way she said need as if we were in a planning meeting. The calendar on the fridge was the digital kind now, a glowing rectangle with blocks of color and little icons. I leaned closer and saw a bell next to doctor, a heart next to walk, and a triangle next to screen. The triangle bothered me for a reason I couldn't name. After she left for a quick errand, I stood in the quiet and listened for what the house would tell me if I let it. The clock above the stove ticked 5 seconds a hair too slow. The new rug muffled footfalls so evenly that I almost missed my own. I opened the top drawer where I used to keep rubber bands and found a neat row of batteries, all facing the same way like soldiers. In the second drawer, a bundle of old letters had been rubber banded together and labeled Archive in purple ink. Tasha writes faster than that when she's in a hurry. The loops on the A were patient. I set the bundle down and felt my mouth go dry, the way it does when you're about to say something you're not sure you have the right to say. My phone buzzed. An email flagged. Important shouted, "Verify identity," now in capital letters with a bank logo that looked like it had been ironed too hot. The greeting started with "Dear Customer" instead of my name, and a hyphen in the sender's address was where it shouldn't be. The message urged me to click a big blue button that swelled when I touched the screen, almost enough to trick me into giving it what it wanted. I set the phone face down and breathed into my cupped hands the way they taught us in choir when the high notes felt like cliffs. I have delivered mail. I have seen real envelopes and fake ones. I reminded myself that scams rely on fatigue and on people saying yes to end a conversation with a machine. I went to the hall closet and found the roll of painter's tape I use when I'm serious. The guest room wall was a polite gray, empty enough to hold something truer. I tore a sheet of butcher paper from the arts and crafts stash I keep for visiting kids and taped it up at eye level. The paper felt like a promise I could touch. I drew a cross to make 4 squares and named them with a pencil that left a soft shine. Money, people, devices, routines. It wasn't a grand plan. It was a way to ask the house itself to testify. In the money square, I wrote what I knew without writing what I felt. In people, I wrote my name and Tasha's and left space beside each like an aisle in a church. When the alarm on the dispenser chirped again, I didn't rush. I let the sound finish its little song and die the way a wind chime does when the breeze runs out. Tasha came in and saw the paper. She smiled too brightly. "Project?" she asked. I said, "A map," and waited for her face to tighten the way it does when I'm not joking. She set a paper bag on the counter and kept her palm on it an extra second, as if the bag could tell me something if I stared long enough. "Good idea," she said, and the words landed on the floor between us and didn't break. I wrote door under devices and then, very lightly, control under routines. By late afternoon, the digital calendar chimed a reminder to hydrate, and I poured water into a glass because I can still do that without an audience. The sun moved to the far side of the house and painted a bright rectangle on the floor that didn't reach the couch, and the shade on the couch felt intentional. I stood in the light and then stepped out of it and let the difference tell me its small truth. I looked at the wall again, at the empty spaces waiting for names and arrows and times, and I thought about how much of being old is learning which questions to ask out loud and which ones to save for when you have ink and witnesses. The house settled, the blinds sighed, and I wrote one more word in the bottom corner of the map, a word I don't use lightly: boundaries. I put the pencil down and wondered who would flinch first when I pointed to it. I started with the map on the wall and a ruler because straight lines calm an unsteady heart. The butcher paper took pencil well. The graphite left a soft shine when I leaned the lamp toward it. Under money, I wrote the 3 transfers with their exact times, copying from the emails letter by letter like a choir reading notes. Dolores picked up on the second ring and said she'd swing by later, but for now, work in columns, nya. Don't let the numbers talk over each other. I drew a left margin and let the house get quiet enough to hear my own thinking. The emails were small doors, so I opened each one and wrote what I saw, not what I feared. Amount, timestamp, confirmation code, and a destination string that looked like a license plate invented by a robot. I called the bank and told the young man I was recovering from surgery and needed fax. He put kindness in his voice that didn't slow him down. He confirmed logins from my city on a device not recognized and said they'd need documentation to freeze anything. "Collect screenshots, print to PDF, note IP if available," he said, and I repeated his words so they would belong to me too. Evidence lives in corners, so I went to the corner that watches everyone, the doorbell camera. The app icon still sat in a folder called Porch, where I hide things I mean to fix. History showed a thin stack of thumbnails, gray at first, then alive when I tapped them. 2 nights after I came home, a delivery at 11:48 p.m. A small box, the kind that loves cords and instructions. The driver set it down and left without a knock. A minute later, Tasha opened the door in socks, shoulders tight, glanced over her left shoulder like a person measuring the size of a secret, and pulled the box inside. I took screenshots of the time, the shape of the package, the way her right hand tucked hair behind her ear twice in 6 seconds, the way she does when she's holding back a thought. I checked earlier clips. Another box 2 days before surgery at 9:12 p.m. This one flatter, the kind that could hide a new phone or a case for one. When I paused the video, the house was all aglow and the porch light made the cardboard glow. I saved stills and wrote the tracking numbers from the labels I could zoom enough to read. The smell of old tape rose in my head like a memory you don't want but need. Dolores's grandson Malcolm answered my call with a voice that sounded like coffee and a restless brain. I told him I was not looking for drama, only order. He said, "Order is evidence alphabetized," and walked me through preserving what I had. Export the doorbell clips, save the emails as PDFs, forward the fake verification to a folder marked suspicious so it lives where I can point to it. "Any handles or nicknames?" he asked, and I said not yet, only strings that begin with 0x and end like the road in summer heat. He said those strings could be a wallet, and that we could learn if money walked the same path twice. He sent me a simple link and a simple instruction. Paste the confirmation hash, not the name, and don't click anything else. The page that opened looked like a spreadsheet had learned to hold its breath. I pasted the long number from one email, and the screen returned a trail, not of bills, but of arrows out and out again. The same destination appeared on all 3 transfers, a stubborn line of characters that felt like a lock without a face. I wrote it on the map in block letters big enough to read from the hallway, and under it I wrote one honest question. Who owns this door? Tasha came home early, set her keys down too quietly, and stood like someone who forgot which room pain belongs to. I asked her to sit at the table where truth has fewer exits, and she did, smoothing a napkin as if creases could keep the story straight. She said she tried to fix everything and broke it instead, then stared at the salt shaker like it might answer for her. My hands wanted to fuss with the placemat, but I kept them flat because fidgeting gives doubt a seat. I told her we were using plain words and whole times today. She nodded without meeting my eyes. That was a yes, that meant maybe. The kettle clicked and the house took a slow breath. I poured peppermint tea and let the steam be our rope. She said there was a man, then corrected herself, a profile that felt like a man who knew how to sound like help. She gave me the handle, a heroic mash of letters trying too hard to sound safe, and said they met in a comment thread where he pitched kindness like a product. The compliments came first, then small emergencies, then late requests that made her feel useful and cornered at the same time. I listened for the hinge where need becomes demand and found it sitting in the silence between her sentences. He taught her to move money like water around rocks so it never looked straight to anyone glancing at the stream. She confessed that speed felt like safety, that moving fast kept fear from blooming in the dark. When she paused, I saw the faint crescent of phone glow still living in her eyes, the color of sleeplessness. Her thumb pinched the napkin until the paper shivered. I asked what he asked for in plain words, and she said, "Access verification, secrecy until morning. Morning is when lies evaporate if you let the light hit them and stand still long enough to watch." I told her we would set roles before forgiveness because boundaries hold weight when the floor wobbles. Caregiver was not custodian, granddaughter was not guardian, and I would not be audited out of my own life after spending it building one. Her mouth tightened, then softened like butter left a minute on the counter, and she asked if I hated her. I said hate is a bonfire. I prefer a stove because a stove holds heat you can use and turn down. The kettle hissed in agreement and told us to keep our voices steady. We wrote on a yellow pad the rules houses need, when love means well but wanders. No switches without explanations, no locks without conversations, no accounts without both names on the decision. She read the list aloud, and the words felt like new shoes, stiff but pointed in the right direction. My shoulders let down a fraction, not victory, only standing room for the next hard thing. I called Dolores to sit as a witness, and she arrived with a tote of pens and that accountant's stillness that makes paper behave even when people don't. We dated the page and slid the pen toward Tasha, because accountability writes from the body that owes it, not from the person who hurts. Tasha listed every account she touched, every platform and username opened in fear, and the times she moved fast because panic sold her a parachute made of promises. Dolores watched for drift and stopped her twice when numbers blurred, saying, "We don't let fear do the math in this house." We added exporting messages with full headers and saving copies where names cannot be edited by thumb. I initialed each paragraph, an old postal habit that says a human stood behind this sentence and will stand again tomorrow. The room quieted the way rooms do when people take their own weight back from the air. Coffee went on, and the smell put corners back on the morning. Tasha rubbed the bridge of her nose like someone finally taking off tight glasses. We turned the page and faced the not quite man with the valiant handle and decided to give him daylight because shadows breed excuses. Tasha would export the threads with timestamps and capture the images that show where messages actually came from, not just the names they wore to the dance. We would store everything in a folder with a boring name because predators love drama but respect filing systems less than locks. She set a time, 9 tomorrow, to pull the records before habit or a hidden hand erased them without asking. I asked if any money went both ways, and she said the gifts were emotional, which charges interest that collects in shame. I wrote that down because metaphors sometimes point to ledger lines when numbers hide their faces. We agreed she would send a short statement to a support group Malcolm mentioned, not for pity, but for footing. Standing next to people who know the shape of this corner keeps you from thinking the corner is you. Rooms have corners so you can see where walls meet and whether they are square. When Dolores left, she tapped the paper twice and told me to file it where important things live. So I slid the document into my old recipe box because I trust boxes that smell like nutmeg and effort. In the doorway, Tasha hovered as if doorways had votes and she was waiting for mine to be counted. I told her I was still raising her, not as a child, but as a citizen of this house, and citizenship means telling the truth when it knocks late. She nodded and her face changed in a small way, like a room when you switch on one more lamp that was there all along. We stood a minute without talking, the kind of quiet that adds instead of subtracts, then chopped onions side by side so the sting in our eyes could belong to dinner. After the dishes, I went to the wall map and sharpened my pencil until the point felt honest. Under people, I wrote our names and the word accountable in letters big enough to read from the sink. Below the wallet string, I added the handle and drew a small sun beside tomorrow at 9, then wrote one more question along the bottom edge for both of us to answer. If love without boundaries isn't protection, what is it? Morning came up pale and undecided, so I decided for it. The kitchen camera app let me in, the timeline sliding to the night before surgery. There I was in a blue robe, steam curling off the kettle, fingers flattening a placemat. I straighten when I'm nervous. Tasha sat tight to her laptop, shoulders like a seatbelt in sudden air. I asked what else we should do, and she said, "Let's add one more layer just in case." The timestamp read 9:42 p.m. I watched my mouth shape the letters of my banking password as if threading a needle. Tasha repeated each piece and the screen lit her face. No one grabbed my hand or raised a voice. There was only fear leaning on urgency, and I let it. When I finished, I said, "Write it down," and the kettle clicked like a period. I paused in my open mouth, and embarrassment arrived without footsteps. My mind tried on excuses. Poor lighting, morphine haze, bad angle. But the robe was mine, the placemat is mine, the tiny sigh is mine. Cameras don't lie, they remember. I let the clip run and saw myself tug my sleeve, touch the old wrist scar, not a two-step like gospel. Extra locks sound like wisdom until you realize someone else pocketed the keys. I backed out of the app and set the tablet down as if it could bruise. Shame can make you small or precise. I've lived too long to choose small. I pulled a fresh sheet and printed. I read the password aloud. Under it, fear is not consent, but it sounds like it. Then I listed the next steps like Sunday lists. Document sequence, call counsel, request freeze, and note influence. I dated the page with my good pen. My heartbeat steadied like a metronome a choir can follow. Dolores answered on the first ring and told me to keep that video like jewelry. She gave me a community attorney's number. Ms. Moreno took the call after her voice had structure. She named what I felt: undue influence, fear, medication, and timing bending decisions. She asked what I could prove, not what I suspected, so I told her about the clip, the emails, the doorbell times, and the ledger on my wall. She told me to export everything with timestamps and print email headers like return addresses. We set a plan that felt like framing a house. I would export the kitchen footage, save it twice, and print the transfer chain, stapled in order so panic couldn't shuffle it. She would draft a letter requesting a temporary freeze and prepare an affidavit on capacity. what I understood and when, and what pressure sat in the room. When we hung up, the house stood with me instead of around me. I wrote at the bottom of the page, "Protect the woman who remembers." Tasha hovered in the doorway like a child outside the principal's office. I told her what the video showed and that I was writing it down because truth earns its place. She said she was sorry in the small voice I hadn't heard since she broke my only glass cake stand. I said remorse is a start, not a plan. She asked what I needed. I said time-stamped exports at 9 and space to breathe while the letters went out. She set her phone on the counter like a truce and left it there. I went to the wall and drew a line from password to timestamp to freeze, a track my eyes could follow when doubt fogged the station. I let that line hold me upright. Malcolm arrived late morning with a backpack that looked like it knew secrets. He set his laptop on my dining table and asked for the Wi-Fi the way a nurse asks for name and birthday. Routine, precise, no drama to hide behind. I handed him the password and watched his fingers, that loose drumming rhythm young people have when their thoughts prefer to travel in 10 lanes. He didn't promise miracles, he promised process, copy, verify, preserve. Sunlight slid across my wall map and brightened the square labeled people until our names looked less alone. Tasha hovered by the doorway with her arms crossed under her ribs, as if keeping something from spilling. We started with the handle she'd scrawled on the yellow pad, a brave tangle of letters pretending to be a person. Malcolm ran it through places I didn't know existed, corners where usernames leave footprints they never meant to. The same face smiled from a watch ad, a travel blog, a hair loss forum. 3 lives borrowed by 1 lie. Stock, Malcolm said, and the word fell like a gavel on a soft table. Tasha's mouth went flat, relief and dread grabbing the same chair. My stomach did that elevator drop that tells you your body knows before your pride does. He exported the chat threads with timestamps and raw headers, tiny spines behind the words that decide if the sentences can stand. One header pointed to a relay service. He said the messages took the long way round so they'd feel foreign when they were not. He highlighted the payment requests and their hungry cadence. Now, urgent, final, last chance, and the rhythm sounded like a marching band 3 blocks over. I could hear it in my bones the way you hear thunder before the rain admits it's coming. He asked about calls. Tasha said there were 2, both short, both full of static, and a borrowed accent that didn't fit any zip code. We moved to the wallet string that swallowed my savings. Malcolm pasted it into a page that looked like a river map. Gray boxes feeding gray boxes until my eyes wanted to close. He zoomed until the lines behaved. 3 arrows from my side flowed into the same wide hub, a box that had collected more than its share of afraid money. From there, branches scattered to fresh addresses like seeds after a mower. Mixer, he said. Not the headline kind. More like a community pool where everyone leaves with someone else's water and swears it's clean. I wrote the hub on my map in block letters deep enough to leave a groove. Dolores arrived with cold fried chicken and the patience of a woman who balances books and people without dropping either. She listened while Malcolm walked me through, preserving a chain that refuses to stay still. Slow down after each step, she said, so paper can catch up to truth. We printed screenshots, clipped the margins straight, and slid them into a 3-ring binder I hadn't opened since Tasha's middle school choir trips. I numbered pages with a thin black pen and initialed each corner because corners make people behave. Malcolm said we should send the set with an affidavit to Ms. Moreno before anyone decides to tidy the internet. At 2, Malcolm asked if we could make a controlled call. Nothing theatrical, just a check for presence. Tasha's eyes went wide, the way a deer's do when it hears branches argue. She said she'd rather not, then said she would, then set her conditions. Speakerphone, 3 minutes, no promises. We wrote the rules down because rules keep air from thinning. Malcolm drafted a tiny script that didn't sound like a script and slid it across the table like a communion plate. One technical question we already know, he said. Then listen for the stumble that lives between lies. We called it 217 because I like clock numbers that feel real under the tongue. The ringtone was the generic kind, distant and rinsed. When the voice arrived, it was warm but tinny, like a church microphone held too close to the mouth. He used Tasha's nickname and apologized for missing her earlier message, a detail meant to bind before asking. Malcolm typed live captions so I could read while my heart climbed the stairs of my ribs. Tasha asked about a setting he'd pushed her to change weeks ago. He hesitated half a breath, guessed wrong, and then praised her for being careful, the way a thief compliments a lock he plans to pick. He pivoted to urgency the second the question didn't flatter him. The window was closing. The penalty would hit. The final opportunity needed her within the hour. He stacked pressure with sweetness, the way a fair booth salesman piles fudge when you came for a broom. "Not today," Tasha said, and my hand found the table's edge like a railing. Malcolm cut the call at 3 minutes and saved the recording, then saved it again in a folder with a boring name predators would skip. The silence afterward wasn't empty. It hummed like a transformer behind a church. I realized my fist had been clenched around nothing but air. We sent the binder scans, chat exports, and call log to Ms. Moreno with a line that said, "Ready for the next step." While files crawled through the upload bar, Malcolm searched the hub address against public posts. A volunteer spreadsheet blinked open, 3 states, columns of dates, and amounts like a cemetery of numbers. One line named a woman in Ohio, 70 grandkids, pantry reorganized by a relative, for safety. I put my fingertip on that sentence the way you test a bruise to see if it still hurts. The wood of the table felt cooler there, or maybe my blood stepped back to make room for anger that could read. Dolores poured coffee and split a drumstick with surgical fairness. "We'll need witnesses," she said, "and copies that don't get tired." Malcolm nodded and mapped the next steps in nouns I could hold: export, notarize, notify. He also set an alert on the hub so if new branches sprouted, we'd get a ping instead of a surprise. Tasha didn't touch her phone for a full minute, which in our house counted as distance. She watched me sign the binder's index and straighten the stack twice. I watched her breathing return to its original length. Evening came soft and gold and decided to bless whatever it touched. The binder, the phone, the map, my hands. We cleared the table and left the stack where I could find it, with sleep in my eyes. I made tea and let the mint linger on my tongue until the flavor decided to stay. Malcolm zipped his backpack and promised to send the river chart with labels anyone could follow. When the door closed behind him, the house exhaled. I stood before my wall and drew a small sun beside the hub's stubborn name, then wrote one clean question under devices so I would not forget it in the night. Who is holding the other end of this wire? By mid-morning, Ms. Moreno's letterhead sat in my inbox like a backbone. She had drafted a request for a temporary freeze with sentences that carried their own weight, each one ending where it meant to. She asked me to sign an affidavit about capacity and timing, so I read every line out loud at the table and felt the words land in my mouth like small stones you can step on without sinking. Tasha watched in a chair pulled 2 inches back from the table, not quite in or out, and handed me the pen when my hand hovered. I signed in blue because blue looks like confidence when the copier takes the color away. Ms. Moreno said a notary would come to the house before lunch, and a courier would take the packet straight to the bank's risk team before the afternoon went soft. The notary arrived with a briefcase that behaved better than most people. He checked my ID with the seriousness of someone measuring a bridge before a parade, then slid the stamp across the page and pressed down. The thump felt final in a nice way, like closing a solid door with your own hand. When he left, I called the bank and asked the young man from earlier to escalate the case. His voice shifted into a tone with fewer apologies. He read a script that promised a review within business hours and said a provisional credit might apply while their investigation followed, which we had already run. I gave him the courier tracking number, the attorney's letter reference, and the list of times I could swear to with daylight in the room. When he put me on hold, the music sounded like a song that hopes you won't notice it's repeating. I noticed and stayed anyway because holding is still a kind of standing. Malcolm came just after the hold music gave up. He set a microphone on the table and asked if I wanted to be blurred in every way a voice can be blurred. I said I wanted to sound like myself without giving liars a new road to drive on. He nodded and built a little studio out of quiet. Pillows stacked, a blanket draped over the chair back, a tea set off to the side where steam wouldn't whisper into the track. He asked questions that didn't bruise, then the one that mattered. What do you want this to do? I told him I wanted a record that didn't shake, something a woman could put in her pocket next to the keys she still owns. We recorded in one take, not because I was brave, but because the story had already been told to me by the room, the calendar, and my own breathing. The episode posted around 3. A square thumbnail sitting in a feed between recipe hacks, and a dog that knows how to open a gate. He titled it The Kitchen Table Freeze. which made me smile because most miracles I've seen happen between a dish towel and a stack of bills. Comments slid in like rain under a door. A retired nurse from Michigan wrote that her son had simplified her phone and she couldn't find her photos. A man in Texas said his mother signed something after anesthesia and he had wondered if that counted as consent. A woman a few towns over said she recognized the pacing of the messages, the way urgency grows in polite words like mold under paint. Malcolm set the moderation to kind and deleted the ones that tried to sell more fear. I watched the play counter climb the way bread rises when you don't open the oven too soon. At 4, Helen called, with the kind of energy that makes you believe a hallway can be widened by intention. She said the fellowship hall was free on Saturday if I could speak for 20 minutes on staying steady online and then answer questions over coffee. I told her I didn't have handouts, but I had a binder and a voice that could hold a line. She said that was better than a handout, and that Sister Ruth would bring lemon bars because lemon bars make hard truth travel easier. After we hung up, I opened my recipe box and slid out a clean card to write a few reminders. Use big fonts, tell one story at a time, leave room for shame to breathe so it can leave the room. Tasha offered to carry the binder and said she would sit up front if I wanted a familiar face to aim for when the lights were too bright. Saturday came early in the week, the kind of early that belongs to a heart that hasn't stopped knocking. The fellowship hall smelled like coffee and floor wax, and the air held that soft hum of refrigerators and nerves. I stood behind a flimsy podium that was braver than it looked and said my name into a microphone that squeaked once and then remembered how to behave. I didn't give instructions. I told the room what fear sounds like when it pretends to be helpful and how speed can dress up as safety. I described the way a calendar can be kind until it starts speaking for you, and the simple relief of writing times down with ink that will not be updated by anyone's good intentions. When I finished, an old man with a cane said he'd never thought to say no to a setting, and a woman in a red cardigan cried without fussing about it and said she was going home to find her own passwords again. Back at home, an email from the bank waited with formal edges. It said provisional credit had been applied to 2 transfers pending documentation review, and the third required an additional declaration due to timing. The numbers were not all of it, but enough to make the room tilt to the right. I read the line twice that warned about reversal if evidence failed, and felt no fear because we had evidence that stood on its own feet. Ms. Moreno replied within minutes with a new attachment named clearly enough for anyone to respect, and asked me to sign again so the last piece could catch up with the rest. I signed with the same blue pen and thought about how color helps memory stand out when life turns to grayscale. Evening pushed itself gently through the blinds and made a ladder of light on the wall map. I added a small star next to money and wrote the date in the margin too neatly for an ordinary Tuesday. Malcolm texted that a local station wanted a quote, and I told him the quote was simple. I'm not confused, I'm deliberate. He sent back a thumbs up and a link to a Drive folder labeled in his boring style with numbers and nouns. Tasha sat across from me with her hands quiet on the table and asked if I wanted her at the church again next week when the second session was scheduled. I said yes, but as a student, not a guard, and she smiled like a person who finally hears the part of the song that carries the melody. We were clearing the cups when Malcolm's alert pinged the way a smoke detector does when it wants new batteries. The hub address we had started spawned a new branch, a small transfer from a fresh source that matched the cadence of fearful money. He sent the screenshot with a time that underlined itself, 7:11 p.m., a minute that reads the same whichever way you stand. I took a breath that felt like I'd been holding it since I woke from anesthesia and asked out loud the question that had walked with me all day. If the wire's still warm, what door is it trying to open tonight? The alert still glowed on Malcolm's screenshot when I set my phone face down and asked Tasha to meet me in the kitchen. Night had come with careful hands. The porch light drew a small circle on the step like a witness that couldn't be bribed. I pulled out the wooden cutting board that has my knife marks in it and set it in the center of the table like a gavel I'm allowed to touch. My heart was loud but not fast, the drum line of someone who knows the beat and intends to keep it. We're going to hold court here, I said, and the room didn't argue. Tasha stood at the threshold as if there were metal detectors in the air. I pointed to the chair across from mine, the one that faces the clock, because time keeps people honest. She sat, folded her hands, then unfolded them when she saw me watching. I told her we were going to stay with plain words and whole times, and that this was not a trial to win, but a ledger to balance. The word ledger steadied me. Paper is where the world goes when it wants to be believed. I slid a legal pad between us, a blue pen on her side, a black one on mine because color helps the eye separate ownership without raising voices. You'll speak first, I said, and then I'll answer, and then we'll write the part we both agree on. She nodded and stared at the pad like it might open its own mouth. The refrigerator hummed a low note. The heater answered. I remembered teaching her to read at the same table, finger under each word until meaning arrived like a small bus right on time. She said she was sorry without dressing the word up, and that counted. She told me how shame sits in the passenger seat of fear and whispers shortcuts that become dead ends. She said the smart lock was supposed to make me safe, the labels were supposed to help me find things, and the calendar was supposed to remind me I matter. Her eyes stayed dry, which is how I knew she was not performing for mercy. She named the requests she granted, the times she moved fast, the hours she chose silence over daylight because lies hate noon. She said the man on the wire made her feel capable in rooms that often forgot her name. She said she forgot mine for a minute and then hated herself for it. I wrote minute down because minutes are where journeys break or mend. When she was quiet, I turned the pad and wrote back with sentences that walked, not ran. I told her protection without permission is a kind of theft, even when it is set to a gentle ringtone. I said I would not be audited out of my life by convenience, and love in this house would mean eye contact and calendars we agree on. I set 3 stones on the table in the shape of rules. She would no longer hold my passwords. She would not change a setting without me in the room. She would bring every request for money into daylight before the hour turned. I said repayment was not punishment. It was walking the road back with your own feet. Her shoulders dropped the way winter trees do when the ice finally lets go. I called Dolores and asked her to come for cake, which in our circle means bring your calm. She arrived with her tote and took the head of the table like a judge who believes in kitchens. We drafted a document with a title large enough to scare foolishness. Family Agreement for Safety and Responsibility. Dolores read each sentence out loud, as if it were a recipe we planned to serve to neighbors. We put dates next to promises because memory deserves a calendar that doesn't lie. I added a paragraph about the binder, the exports, the attorney, so the story lived in ink, not just in our beating chests. Dolores slid the page toward Tasha and watched her hand. Tasha signed without drama, a steady print, then a signature that remembered itself. We wrote the repayment line with space where the bank's final math would land, and the schedule would start the first Friday after the last letter went through. I offered a jar for cash payments, not as theater, but because jars tell time in quarters when weeks feel slippery. We added a line about the support group Malcolm had mentioned, and the appointment Tasha would make before Friday. I wrote that I would drive if she wanted company, and she said yes in a small voice that felt like a hinge being oiled. We agreed she would sit in the front row at the next church session as a student, not a guard. Dolores notarized what she could and initialed the rest as a witness, her pen tapping the paper twice like a metronome for courage. When the ink dried, the page looked heavier than paper has a right to be. We needed food that could handle truth, so I pulled onions from the basket and handed Tasha the knife I trust. We chopped in rhythm. Tears rose because onions are honest, and it's good to blame the right thing. I toasted bread with butter and cinnamon, the smell rising into the ceiling like a hymn. We ate at the table without ceremony, and the cinnamon did its old soft magic, reminding my mouth that sweetness can survive salt. Tasha told me she had kept a shoebox of postcards from trips we never took, and I told her the recipe box was now also a courthouse, and both could live on the same shelf. She laughed in that shaky way that means air is returning to room. We washed plates side by side, and I let her leave one streak on a glass because perfection is a poor god. When Dolores left, she hugged me longer than usual and whispered that the document should sleep where I sleep. I slid it into the recipe box between apple pie and cornbread, flowery cards that remember birthdays and lean years. The box clicked shut with a small wooden certainty. I carried it to my room and set it where my Bible used to sit when I taught Sunday school, next to the lamp that forgives my eyes. Back in the kitchen, the wall map waited, patient and square. I drew a clean line from people to routines and wrote in block letters we could read from the sink. Boundaries kept, money returning, truth in writing. The porch light made its circle again, and for the first time in weeks I felt the house stand level. We didn't celebrate. We sat. Tasha wrapped the beige throw around her shoulders, and somehow it looked less like a staging prop and more like a blanket doing its job. She asked if she could set the smart lock to ask first, and I said yes because asking is the opposite of erasing. I made mint tea, and the steam carried a memory of my mother, her hand on my wrist the night I told her I could pay my own bills. The clock clicked past 9, and the room stayed whole. I stood, touched the map with my fingertips, and told the house we were done for tonight. Tomorrow could have the wire and its hot new branch. Tonight belonged to the stove, the paper, and the two of us breathing the same careful air. The morning the bank's last message arrived, the house smelled like toast and lemon oil, a clean ordinary I had missed. The subject line didn't brag. It said review complete and let the body carry the news. Funds returned in part, safeguards confirmed, reconciliation pending. I read it again, slower, and let my shoulders settle, the way a field remembers itself after rain. Tasha poured coffee and asked if I wanted the mug with the chip. I did, because it fits my thumb where worry used to sit. We didn't celebrate. We put the kettle away, wiped the counter, and stood in the quiet we'd been saving. Outside, the trash truck grumbled down the block, ordinary as a heartbeat, and I let its noise count applause. By noon, I was at church with a binder and peppermints to keep my mouth honest. The fellowship hall hummed with folding chairs and fridge motors, and Sister Ruth's lemon bars glowed under plastic like forgiveness. I didn't lecture. I told a kitchen story with timestamps and let paper do the lifting. We practiced saying no, waiting 10 breaths before tapping blue and asking why a screen wants our face at odd hours. Questions came like rain. What if my son insists? What if I forget? What if the button says urgent? I said urgency can wait for daylight. And forgetting is a reason to write, not surrender. When the refrigerator sighed, I closed. I am not confused, I am methodical, and you can be too. In the afternoon, I planted rosemary cuttings behind the porch, pushing stems into warm dirt with a spoon because my trowel had wandered. The air tasted green, and an old hymn rose without music, only measure. Tasha knelt with the watering can and asked to borrow my scissors. I said yes and made a note to ask for them back. The neighbor kids chalked hopscotch on the mailbox, numbers skipping where the cement cracked. I wrote them silently anyway, because numbers like being known. When a breeze shifted, the rosemary gave off that medicinal sweetness I trust more than speeches. I thought about how recovery rarely returns everything, how forgiveness is a schedule, not a switch, and let the soil take my mood like rain. That evening, we opened windows and let the rooms trade air with the street. I tore 3 recipe cards and wrote a title across each in slow blue letters. Scent Ledger. On the first, I wrote peppermint steam, the alto I lean on when a note sits high. On the second, I wrote frying onions, truth's sidekick, respected and unforgiving. On the third, I wrote rain on concrete, because the driveway carried that freight train smell that holds you still. I tucked the cards behind cornbread and apple pie so comfort and caution could live together. I added today's date in the corner for later. When night cooled, the ledger held steady in the box like a heartbeat. I could hear if I listened very closely. We held a second session, and this time Tasha stood during questions and said she had learned to ask first. Her voice didn't wobble, and the air shifted the way groups do when honesty makes room. A widow from Ohio joined by tablet. Her porch swing voice told us her pantry had been reorganized for safety until she couldn't find herself. She said she missed choosing badly because choosing at all felt like the right return. I wrote that in the margin. Afterward, we shared defenses that work. A list by the phone, a neighbor with a spare key, and a rule that nothing urgent arrives by email at midnight. The church lights clicked off in rows, and we walked out under a sky that didn't rush. At home, I cleaned the guest room sign and put it in the donation box, not out of spite, but because names should match reality. The room smelled like sun-warmed dust and paper. I opened the curtains and moved my flowered chair back under the window where it knows me. The beige throw finally softened into something that remembered bodies. I folded it the long way and left it ready. On the wall, I drew a small star beside people and wrote steadily where it could catch my eye. The smart lock, newly polite, asked before blinking, and the yes felt earned, not extracted. I set a glass jar on the shelf and dropped in a coin so the future could hear us breathing. Days began to stack like neat plates. I walked the block with Helen and counted mailboxes for habit's sake, noting the tilting ones that could use a shim. Mr. Washington traded oranges for a jar of his wife's fig jam. The kind that turns toast into a reason. At home, I set 2 reminders that belong to me. Check the bank on Fridays with coffee, call Ms. Moreno at the month's end with pages. Tasha slid her first payment into the glass jar, quarters talking softly among themselves. She signed up for the support group, Tuesdays at 7, a detail that felt like a hinge greased. When I wrote the time on the calendar, I used blue ink because it stays steady when copiers get grayed out. One afternoon, an envelope arrived with a weight that made the mail slot exhale. Final reconciliation enclosed, it said, and the math held. Not everything returned. I let that be true without letting it drive. Loss may stand, not steer. I laid the paper flat and opened the cent ledger. I wrote Magnolia Waxy Sweet, my mother's Sunday hat, under my palms. Tasha brought toast and asked for jam or peach. I said both. The smart lock asked, and I answered yes. When evening slid down the block, I sat on the porch and let the day choose its shelf. I am not smaller, I thought, only clearer. Truth didn't give money meaning. It gave my spine one. The rosemary lifted its arms and the house held. In the end, the math was simple. Protection without permission is control, and love without boundaries isn't love at all. I'm Naya, 72 years old, and I learned that I am not confused. I am methodical. When fear tried to rush me, I slowed it down with ink, timestamps, and a steady breath. I took back my choices, one small yes at a time. Freedom, I've found, is not the absence of danger. It's the presence of clear consent, clear records, and a spine that remembers its shape. If Noya's journey spoke to you, tap like to help this story reach someone who needs it. Subscribe for more quiet, steel-spined stories and comment below. I'm truly reading. Here's a question to sit with. When have you mistaken urgency for safety? And what boundary brought you back to yourself? Share one lesson or one small habit you'll try this week. Thank you for giving us your time and trust today. Take care of your voice, take care of your paper trail, and we'll see you in the next one.